Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on behalf of SASLO and the Department of Mercantile Law. I would like to welcome you to this session tonight. My name is Monre Buerta and I am the head of Department of Mercantile Law. I want to quickly just introduce the chair for tonight and the two speakers, and then I'm done with my job. Our chair tonight is Sean Christensen. Some of you might know him very well. He is from the CCMA. He's a convening senior commissioner, head of the Johannesburg and Vaal Vereniging office of the CCMA. A few of his recent achievements has been that he's presently the lead facilitator of the Decent Work Plan and establishment of the Bargaining Council for the contract cleaning sector, and also lead facilitator in the Anglo-American Platinum Section 189 capital A mass retrenchment facilitation involving around 12,000 employees. That was in 2013, and he has represented the CCMA at the recent mining Pakisa in 2015. Then we also have our two speakers for tonight. Our first speaker is Leon Louw. Leon is credited with having a few significant impact on the course of events in South Africa, especially regarding the extensive economic reforms that took place during the last 2 decades of apartheid. He has received numerous international awards, and with his wife, Frances Kendall, has been nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize. Presently, he is the executive director of the Free Market Foundation and the Law Review Project. Leon co-authored South Africa, The Solution, and also Let the People Govern, both of which had significant impact on the constitutional process. South Africa, The Solution has been republished in various countries, including the United States of America, Canada, and as after apartheid, The Solution for South Africa. Many of the author's specific proposals for post-apartheid constitution were incorporated in South Africa's new constitution, despite having been almost uniformly dismissed at the time of publication. Small and micro business and black economic empowerment have been Leon's principal interests throughout his public life. He has been intimately involved with and a prominent activist for organized and informal SMMEs, starting with the fledgling National African Federation of Chambers of Commerce and the Johannesburg street vendors in the late 1960s. Much of his life presently is spent with grassroots black communities in tribal areas and inner cities, fighting for the right to trade freely and own the land they occupy. Our second speaker is Gilad Isaacs. He is currently enrolled for his PhD in economics, School of African and Oriental Studies. He is also employed at the CSID, School of Economic and Business Sciences, University of Witwatersrand, and is a lead researcher for projects of the European Union. He is coordinator for the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative, and he also lectures a very difficult subject, macroeconomics. He previously was also employed by the Treatment Action Campaign and also worked for the Applied Education Research Organization in Cape Town. And that is our speakers and our chair for tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monre, and good evening, everybody. I must admit I'm feeling protected having so many of my CCMA colleagues here, so thanks for making it, guys. I thought, just to set the context, the invitation that you all received was quite interesting, the 2 excerpts. And I think just to kick off this whole debate, maybe we should just reiterate what was in that invitation. I'm very careful to say that so that it's not me saying this or deciding to put this in here. And I want to quote the view of the Free Market Foundation. Advocates of a minimum wage law display a callous disregard for South Africa's most vulnerable citizens, 8 million unemployed compatriots, 1 million people in marginal jobs, tens of thousands of marginal businesses, and hundreds of thousands of aspirant entrepreneurs. The victims of heaping privileges on people fortunate enough to be employed are mostly young or elderly or disabled, uneducated black South Africans, close quote. The view of the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative is as follows. The institution of a national minimum wage, correctly designed and effectively implemented, can change the lives of millions of South Africans. The evidence is unequivocal. Minimum wages reduce inequality and poverty, can spur economic growth, and do so with little or no impact on employment. A national minimum wage can be part of South Africa's economic solution, close quotes. Now, just last week Friday, the Moody's report was released, and that report confirmed South Africa's rating, albeit negative. What I found interesting in the report was the rationale for confirming the ratings, and it was based on three drivers. And the first driver for this rationale was the likelihood of growth recovery beyond 2016. Within this first driver, they identify the recent rapprochements between the government, business and labor as holding promise from the standpoint of identifying areas of mutual concern. They then also cite a number of benchmark actions related to matters such as the rationalization of state-owned enterprises and the enactment of key labor market reforms. They then go on to state that to the extent that implementation of such measures help boost business confidence, investment and job creation, they would improve prospects for gradually reducing wide economic disparities and high levels of poverty, deprivation and unemployment. And I think that would be the perfect background setting for the debate that we are going to have here this evening. What is going to happen now is that Leon and Gilad are both going to do presentations, and that presentations are obviously going to inform the two very opposing views. The one, on the one hand, that a national minimum wage is bad for the economy and will destroy jobs, and on the other hand, that it will have a positive, or could have a positive effect on the economy by stimulating demand and creating jobs. I think the question on all of our lips is, simply put, can South Africa, in the prevailing current national and global economic conditions, afford to have a national minimum wage? I want to invite our first speaker. Who is our first speaker? Leon from the Free Market Foundation. And I think Leon will give us a good perspective of what informs the views of the Free Market Foundation.
It's not clear to me why we are discussing the need for a minimum wage. We have one. We have a national minimum wage. The majority of South African workers are in the sector that earn it, and it's the biggest sector in the South African economy. And the minimum wage for those people, nearly 9 million, is zero. They are in the biggest sector, the unemployment sector. And they already have the regulated minimum wage, and all minimum wages, by the way, are always the same. They're always zero. And that is the wage to which people are condemned by anybody who proposes a minimum wage. I do realize also that it's SAS law, and with some of the people here, I am Daniel in the lion's den. The self-interest of most people here is that there should be lots of law governing labor. That's what SAS law, after all, is about. And there should be a minimum wage, and there should be anything that compounds it. It's like if I were in a meeting of dentists, I would imagine they would want a discussion about how to maximize tooth decay, and along with it, truth decay. So let me say, though, that I don't mind being in the lion's den. My name is Leon Louw, which, after all, is lion in Dutch and lion in French. So I'm lion, lion. So maybe you're in the lion's den, so beware. Having said that, the majority of South Africans have a minimum wage, and that minimum wage is zero, I'm going to address the issue from three perspectives, what I call Triple H. from the heart first, and that's the one I regard as most important, then the head, which I regard as the a priori theory, and then the hard data, so heart, head, and heart. And the hard data is the one that I think is least relevant for reasons I'll give. Firstly, the emotional and the heart. I think, and I make no apology for saying this, that to have a discussion about a minimum wage at this time in South Africa, when the Central Statistical Stats SA said just on Monday, 2 days ago, that unemployment is now 26.7%, narrowly defined, the highest it has ever been in our history. If you have the expanded number, it's 36.3. Over half of all youth have never had a job and are not likely to have one unless the labour law is changed very substantially, and will have zero chance of earning anything more than the minimum wage of 0 if it is introduced. 9 million people roughly unemployed. Now those are numbers. We all just play around with numbers, as I'm sorry to say the institute we're going to hear does. But I want you to pause for a moment and just reflect on the fact that each one of those people is a real human being. And I would encourage the people in this room to get out of your air-conditioned office into your air-conditioned luxury 4x4 and drive into a shanty town and go and meet one of these 9 million or 8.5 or 8 or 6 or whatever the number is people. One human being. Go and be with them. And then come and tell me you still want a minimum wage. When those destitute people living in squalor, indignity, tramp the streets hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, they are humiliated. They are impoverished, they are scared, they are frightened, they suffer insecurity, they have to face their families. The social and psychological implications are astounding. Don't think of the statistic. It's frightening. It's the highest rate of enduring unemployment in the world. Think of those human beings. And if you are sitting there thinking it's in your self-interest because you get legal fees or whatever it is, you have a job that is advanced, just pause for a moment and think about the inhumanity, the callous inhumanity, and say, no, hold on a sec. There are human beings here, millions of human beings, who matter. And what you want for them is the freedom to go and sell their labour for something, to do something. Now, you've heard, it was Alan Fine said in a Business Day article recently, that the Free Market Foundation is pro-business. I have the quote here. Yes, we are. The business we're pro is the destitute people trying to survive labour law, which has rendered them into this ghastly human condition that people talk about as if it's a statistic, as if it's some kind of macroeconomic masturbation that should take place. No. When Joburg City Council drove 6,000 street traders off the street before Christmas in 2014, and the people they used was the cleansing department, the people who clean litter off the streets, in an operation called Operation Clean Sweep. These people from the air-conditioned offices sent out a private hit squad called the Red Ants to go and clear human beings off the street as if they litter. Some of you may know, you probably don't, but you should, that the Constitutional Court ruled in its fastest ever decision, unanimously, that all of them have to be allowed back and the council had to back off. Who brought that case? We did. Where were the people who cared? Nowhere. These are the so-called free market capitalists who supposedly don't care and don't want a minimum wage. We don't want a minimum wage because we don't want maximum suffering. We want minimum human indignity. So let's move on over here. The people who would be affected by a minimum wage as a matter of the heart is the people at the bottom of the pile, the most vulnerable people, the people who are unskilled, When we brought a case against a section in the Labour Relations Act, some of you lawyers may know about it, odd sort of outcome where we think we won, but the other side have a Pyrrhic victory and think they won. But nonetheless, it actually went further than we even wanted. Who contacted us and wanted to come in as amicus curiae? The Society for the Disabled. They people can't get jobs under these laws. And it's people, it's the youth, it's the unskilled, it's the rural migrants, it's the aged, it's the mentally challenged. These are the people to whom your heart should go out. These are the people for whom callous disregard is contained in everyone who propagates a minimum wage. Not the fortunate, lucky ones who have the wage. And what's more, we will hear a proposal, I suspect, that the wage should be 6,000 rand. Why are you so cruel? 6,000? You surely don't expect people to live on 6,000? Why not 60,000? Why not 1 million? Why not 1 billion? I mean, you know, and we all know, that as you raise the bar, all you do is change the degree. The quantity of people you render unemployed rises. And then we have, I'm sorry to say, out here, this twaddle that if you pay the wage, it boosts the economy because people go out and spend it. Well, why not just become overnight the wealthiest country on earth? Just pay everybody R1 trillion a day. We will be the wealthiest country on earth instantly, and the economy will be boosted and we will have economic growth. Because you know and everybody knows it's nonsense. That all it is a question of how much wealth is actually produced by real working people who are allowed to get a job and not kept out of the job by such measures as a minimum wage. Now the head. The head intellectual part, a priorism, which is the School of Economics, I think is the only one you can apply here, is to say what's logical. Then we'll get into the data. You surely don't think you can raise the price of something and have people buy just as much, or even more. Surely nobody who uses their other synapse to reach that conclusion. Surely you have to agree that if you make something more expensive, if we were the managers of a company making widgets and we employ 1,000 workers, and the minimum wage says we have to pay them all twice as much, the short-term consequence will be indetectable. Tomorrow they will all still have a job. Tomorrow we will still make as many widgets. And what we will do is we will start selling them at higher prices in order to recover the cost of the minimum wage. And minimum wages are no different from any other price. If you raise the price, you sell less. And what will happen is the consumers now have to pay more for our widgets, and what will they do? They will gradually buy less widgets and buy more something else. Or, if we're very lucky, in these cherry-picked studies where there appears not to be a decline in employment in that sector, what it means is more money is going into it. It comes from somewhere. Namely, something else that consumers are now not buying. There, then the people have lost their jobs in order for the ones who get this higher wage to earn more. So that you, simple logic, a priori logic tells you, if we are making these widgets, what we will do is we will gradually start making woblets instead, and wangles. And we will start selling less widgets and producing less widgets and investing somewhere else. It takes time. That, by the way, gets us into the empirical data. The empirical data, the numbers. Now, there are thousands, literally thousands, of studies that purport to establish by number crunching whether or not minimum wages do or don't cause unemployment, and they are divided. Nobody I know of has tried to even do a count, but this is not a democracy issue, this is a logic issue. But anyway, let's say for argument's sake it's roughly divided. I think it's much more in favour of people who say minimum wages do cause unemployment, which is the overwhelming majority of opinion amongst professional economists. In surveys, they regard that as being likely to be the case, and that they retard growth and brings about market distortions and inefficiency. But the studies typically short-term studies say that if you raise the minimum wage in the fast food industry or the taxi industry, there is in the short term no apparent loss of jobs. In some industries with high elasticity or flexibility, like agriculture, there is a short-term loss of jobs. In South Africa, about half or more. And what happens is when you study the long term, as a recent Fraser Institute study has found, looking at those that say there is no immediate impact, the answer is, if you look at the long term, yes, there is. But let me immediately say, although those are the studies that seem to me to be more likely to be correct, it actually makes no difference, because you can trot out literally thousands on each side, and the ones that we are told tell us in South Africa it will have little or no effect are models, which is really a sort of Excel spreadsheet, but you put the numbers that give you the answer you want in, and your answer comes out. And if it doesn't come out, you change the assumptions in the spreadsheet. So, I would like you to, well, one of the earliest, one of the seminal studies was the black American economist Walter Williams, who looked at unemployment amongst black youth, which in America, like in South Africa, averages around, hovers around 50%, half have no job, and the uneducated, unsophisticated, especially rural ones, have essentially zero chance of getting one. And he found what happened before the minimum wage, unemployment amongst black American youth was lower than amongst white American youth after the minimum wage was shot up. And there are all sorts of reasons, as he explains, why that should be true. And in South Africa, we have a similar result. Unemployment amongst white South Africans is not much higher than it was in '94. The rise in unemployment has been amongst black South Africans, and this should make you think, aren't the measures we're taking counterproductive? Why do we have a result that is so racially ghastly, but more seriously so ghastly in terms of human suffering? I want to conclude by saying, imagine a minimum wage as something quite simple really, complicated in theory, complicated in data and empirical things, which varies from sector to sector, but it changes over time. In some sectors it is slow. Elasticity is high or low, and fast or slow. Now what you have essentially is a ladder, and people are on this ladder. Low wage earners at the top, high wage earners at the bottom, and the minimum wage is a rung of the ladder. It affects almost nobody. It affects the few people who may be nudged up one rung or nudged down one rung. But everyone else stays where they are on the ladder. It doesn't affect people above, it doesn't affect people below, and the propagators of the minimum wage agree and admit to that. So what you do is you simply raise the bar. You raise the quantity of people below the minimum wage by raising it. And that is what you do, maybe not a direct ratcheted effect, but nobody can seriously think that is not the case. And I close where I started. Don't think of it as a number. Think of it as a human being. A suffering, destitute, victimized human being. And I find the discussion even of a minimum wage callous and reprehensible at this time in our history.
Thank you, Leon. Our next speaker, if that was the lion, I'm not quite sure what Gilad is going to call himself. Probably the giant. Welcome, Gilad.
Evening, thanks very much for the introduction and the invitation. If we're a dentist convention, then I'm going to assume that what we're all here to do is to find ways of eliminating tooth erosion. That's what everyone cares about. That we're all in it for the same thing, which is the improvement of this country. The plea made by Leon that this would do untold harm, in order to substantiate that argument or that assertion, what one needs to do is prove that a minimum wage will have no benefit and will in fact actually have harm. And unfortunately, or fortunately for workers, Leon's failed to establish that. And that's really what I hope to present, and I apologize that there will be macroeconomic masturbation and lots of statistics, because those research studies, as in any science or any academic field, help us understand what the facts are. I'm just going to do what I should have done at the beginning, which is load my presentation before I get carried away. You also won't hear a proposal for a 6,000 Rand minimum wage from me, so I don't want to disappoint. I'm going to talk you through 5 different sets of things. Firstly, the objectives, our South African context, some of the international and local evidence, some estimations of what the impact might be, and then some conversation on how one could set a minimum wage. The objectives of a national minimum wage. Internationally, the International Labour Organization has outlined that as attempting to meet workers' basic needs. And that applies to both sectoral like minima, which we have now, as well as the institution of a national minimum wage. In South Africa, it's been particularly focused on also as a manner to combat extremely high levels of inequality. And the NEDLAC Indaba and Ekurhuleni in the end of 2014, which established the process of instituting a national minimum wage, isolated the issue of inequality. Let's be clear also that the national minimum wage is not about creating employment. It is possible, and the evidence shows, that higher wages can spur economic growth and employment gains that may or that may not occur. We cannot evaluate a national minimum wage around whether or not it grows employment. We can evaluate it on whether or not it harms or hinders employment. Why move from a sectoral system to a national system? Will experts from the International Labour Organization isolate these 5 factors? That it covers all workers, that it's easier to enforce, that it provides a level of equality, where sectoral like wages generally discriminate against vulnerable groups. It can be set with an eye on objectives like poverty and inequality, and it can take account not only issues in one sector but in the economy as a whole. The South African context, some of which we all know, and I won't go through in great depth, but extremely high levels of inequality, the highest in the world, and the research from the leading group which analyzes these, which is at UCT, shows that it is wage differentials, not what they call zero earners, which essentially is the unemployed, which is driving inequality. Extremely high levels of poverty, both amongst the unemployed and the employed. The working poor, which I can talk about in the Q&A, how we estimated that there's 54% of workers, full-time workers in this country who do not earn enough to bring them and their immediate dependents above a basic poverty line. And poverty lines refer to your bare subsistence needs. That's 5.5 million full-time workers cannot feed and clothe their families at a poverty level. This idea also, and that is obviously, it breaks down along race lines, with the Black African and coloured workers being most affected. It's very important that we understand how dependency works in South Africa, so we're not lured into thinking that there's some kind of binary opposition between the employed and the unemployed. And as many of my colleagues in economics and in sociology who have done field work in this area show that there's very interesting ways of inter-household income sharing. And South African workers in poor households support, as we know, a high number of dependents. At least it is 2.65, but many of them support 4, 5, 6, 7, up to 10, both of their children and the elderly, but also the unemployed who would benefit from higher income from wage earners. One important thing is to understand who a national minimum wage would impact. I don't want to spend too long here, but essentially on the x-axis, what we have here is the wages in the economy, and on the y-axis, a proportion of income earners. So if you start at, say, 2,500, which is the first red line, and you go up and then over, you see that a minimum wage of 2,500 would impact about 36% of the population. At 3,000, it is just over 40%, and so on. We can also look and understand that minimum wages would impact different sectors in different ways. And it's actually important that we think about this when it comes to actual policy issues. Overwhelmingly, agriculture and domestic work would be the most impacted, which shows the blue line is wages under 2,500. I've got more of this, which we can look at later if we want. Right. With regards to the poverty and inequality, which is the stated objective of a national minimum wage, the evidence here is quite significant in terms of its volume, although new, mainly in the last decade or two, and shows very clear the trends, which is that minimum wages have reduced inequality. They've reduced inequality in the developed world and the developing world. In the UK, it explains about 50% of the reduction of inequality since it was instituted in 1999. In the US, interestingly, the decrease in the minimum wage has been shown to be an explanatory factor in the increase in inequality in the US. In the developing world, it's played a role in decreasing inequality in both the formal and the informal sector, which is a very interesting finding. What we see here is just 3 examples. The blue line represents an increase in the national minimum wage in these 3 countries, and the red line is falling inequality. So we see in these periods, for example, in Argentina, a 200% real increase, so that's excluding the inflationary impact, over a 10-year period, which explains, according to the econometric estimates, 32% in the fall in inequality. These type of statistics have been found to hold true in many Latin American countries, as well as in Asian countries, in Russia, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and elsewhere. Interestingly, the effect was stronger in the informal sector, or at least it covered more countries. So whereas 10 out of 19 Latin American countries had a fall in inequality in the formal sector, it was 14 out of 19 in the informal sector. And that's got to do with what's called a lighthouse effect, through which the minimum wage signals what a fair wage might be in the economy, and that impacts beyond the legislative role. Contrary to what Leon said, the minimum wage does actually affect those above the level. In the UK, it affected people who earned up to 40% above that level. That's higher in developing countries where minimum wages push up wages of those above the minimum wage as well as those at the minimum wage. This is I can circulate these. I put some extra things in case people are interested. Right, the million-dollar question about the employment impact. Now, Umarani from the ILO calls this a second-order question. She says we shouldn't start with the issue of employment. We start with the issue of the objectives, which is poverty and inequality. And employment's relevant to the extent to which it hinders the decrease in poverty and inequality. And of course, if a minimum wage is going to lead to the dire, widespread job losses, then that will harm its intended aims of reducing poverty and inequality. The international consensus, and this is not a fringe view, this is 90% of economists who work in this field, is that institutional or moderate increases to the minimum wage have little or no impact on employment. And we're going to unpack in a few minutes why that is. I put these here as this paper came out a few weeks ago. And what this paper does is very interesting. It's quite a long quote, but essentially, and this first paragraph is interesting. Since the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, sorry, I stutter sometimes when I'm reading. Essentially, it's predictions of the ruinous consequences of minimum wages. And these, especially in young workers, low-skilled workers, etc. And these claims of the sky falling down, you can trace them. We've looked. You can trace them in the US, the UK, Germany, the Brazil, Uruguay, to an extent in Indonesia. These predictions of doom and gloom and of catastrophe are made every time prior to the institutional increase of a minimum wage. These authors went back and looked at every single increase in the federal minimum wage. And as an aside, 500 leading US economists 18 months ago signed a letter to President Obama saying that an increase in the federal minimum wage would have positive benefits and no harm, or that the evidence shows there is most likely little harm to employment. So anyway, this is an interesting article. The best way of assessing, as Leon says, these thousands of studies is they actually have been people who have undertaken a collation of that work. This is an example of what is called a meta-analysis, where essentially you take all of the studies and you plot them. On the far side of 0 is a positive impact, on my near side is a negative impact, and the height shows the level of statistical significance. Okay, and these work on what's called a elasticity, which is the percentage change in employment based on a percentage increase in the minimum wage. And there's been a number of leading meta-analyses done, which are highlighted here, which all show extremely small or statistically insignificant impacts. Let me just be clear, statistically insignificant, because I was called out on this in a newspaper article by a colleague of in the Free Market Foundation, which accused me of saying that the people who lose their livelihoods are insignificant. It's a term which refers to whether or not you can statistically show that there is a verifiable impact. And in all these meta-analyses, the impact congregates around 0. You see it here, you see it here, you see it here. These are the leading research done in the field. This is we're going to skip that. And you see less evidence in the developing world with less research done, and it impacts all varied regionally and on a range of other factors, but essentially you see a similar outcome. This, for example, is on your right, increases in the value of the minimum wage in Latin America, and on the right, the red shows increases in urban employment at the same time and a decrease in informality, like in Brazil, where they managed to formalize employment through the same legislation which increased the minimum wage. In South Africa, in 5 out of 6 sectors I studied so far, there's been shown to be no impact on employment. And those studies, I should say, especially in Bellman and Wolfson, which was the yellow dots, includes both short-run and long-run analysis. The idea that the studies focus only on short-run is false. Despite what we see, which is a harmful impact on agriculture in 2006, we've subsequently seen an increase in agriculture, or a stabilization, at the same time that we've seen an increase in the agricultural minimum wage. So why, if this is so counterintuitive to this gut notion that you increase a price and you stop buying it? For 3 key factors. Firstly, firms adjust. Firms will have been shown to be, that its productivity increases, more output per worker, there's efficiency gains, and higher retention of workers. There is redistribution from high income earners to lower income earners in the firm. There is reduced profit and reductions in hours work or in small non-wage benefits, and some being passed on in increased prices. The economy reallocates employment as well as a stimulus effect, and importantly, we must not be misled to think that the only thing which determines employment is a price level. Actually, employment is determined by investment in the economy, and investment is impacted by a whole range of policies, everything from infrastructure to borrowing costs to our credit rating, etc. I'm running out of time, so there have been statistical analyses of what the impact might be in South Africa, which are not an Excel spreadsheet. In fact, the 2 which we've used, one is used as a forecasting tool by the G20, which is the United Nations Global Policy model. The other is a local model, which I'm going to talk to here. Which essentially, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but it has about 3,600 equations, and the relationships within those equations are estimated based on the standard econometric analysis, which shows how each variable impacts the other. And so there's a whole series of interlinkages in the economy, which is then built and you can alter like one variable and it feeds through into all the others. We modeled like 4 like scenarios, and I'm not going to go through each of them here. I'm pretty much out of time, right, Sean?
Yes.
Okay. But essentially what we see is a increase in real wages, which leads to an increase in spending, and workers do spend more. There is an increase in output, a rise in GDP growth, and a productivity increase. These positive benefits could be, in the model, easily offset by like negative impacts through inflation, a fall in investment, a rise in unemployment, and a weakening of our trade balance. Some of those things do occur, but insufficiently to offset the other gains. This is just some of the actual output, which shows an increase in real wages, in household income, in consumption, in output, in GDP growth, and a small fall in employment. The unemployment rate goes from 25.2 to 25.4 in the narrow definition of employment. We do see a projected fall in both poverty and inequality. These, of course, are estimates. The last thing, which perhaps we can look at in our Q&A, is around indicators, which I've done research for the NEDLAC process, where we've tried to understand what are different indicators which might assist. You can look at one's poverty needs, where we see the individual poverty line is 1,319 in April 2015 rand, and the working poor line is 4,125. Those is the line which an average worker with an average number of dependents must earn in order to raise them out of poverty. We can also look at a ratio of of minimum to average wages, or minimum to median level wages, which is the halfway wage as a indicator of what a minimum wage might be, and you can also look at the current levels of minimum wages through the sectoral bargaining, in the sectoral process. There's also a range of interesting policy and legal questions which we're grappling with. For example, the interaction between laws in the VCEA and the new minimum wage law, etc. So I don't think that there's I don't think that we have a guarantee that a minimum wage at any level would be of huge benefit. It would be absurd for me to stand here and say, pay each worker R1 million, even 12,500 rand, even in our scenarios 6,000 rand leads to instability in the economy. But it's equally absurd to think that any increase in wages is going to lead to hemorrhaging of workers' jobs. It's simply not what's borne out anywhere. It's simply not what the international consensus is on the evidence. And it's very, very, very clear that, I'm in my last sentence. It's very, very clear that a increased minimum wages through a national minimum wage can have a positive impact on reducing the poverty and inequality. Thanks very much. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. Gilad, well, won't you have a seat there, and Leon, won't you join him? I think the format that we're going to take now is to get a few questions from the audience, subject or subsequent to the presentations. I actually want to abuse my position as chair and kick off with one or two questions that I have. Particularly to Gilad, you've skirted the issue of what you believe the national minimum wage should be, and you skirted in a very, in a sense that it's not a criticism of you. And then, secondly, you know, we as a country we already have huge challenges with compliance in respect of our labor laws. Given that a national minimum wage is going to be of general application to all workers, and given, unless of course exempted in certain sectors, and given that we've decriminalized non-compliance, very much unlike Germany, who has instituted their national minimum wage as of last year, and have criminalized non-compliance through customs and excise, I understand. How do you foresee us overcoming these challenges? And I suppose the question that I would want to pose to Leon is, I didn't quite understand you correctly to mean that you are completely opposed to a national minimum wage, unless my understanding wasn't that thorough. If you are not completely opposed to a national minimum wage, what do you believe should be the factors that should drive the thinking of the level at which we should set a minimum wage? And if that were to be the case, what would that be relative to current wage determinations in particularly agriculture and domestic? I'm going to allow them to deal with that before I allow the audience to have a go at them like I've had, hopefully. And I'm not sure, Leon, would you perhaps also take this opportunity to respond to Gilad's presentation and also perhaps deal with those?
Oh, with pleasure. Then I presume he gets a chance to respond to me, otherwise it wouldn't be fair. And above all, people like me are in favor of being fair. Let me say firstly, the answer is we have a minimum wage at zero. I thought I said so. I don't know if you can go much lower than zero, but some people seem to want to. And what happens, of course, is that 9 million people who Gilad says unemployment doesn't increase inequality, just think about that statement. 9 million people earning zero does not increase inequality. Now imagine if those 9 million people had jobs. Now you could have a nice, as I said, econometric masturbation. And I'm all for masturbation, I just think it should be done in private. And you can argue by juggling and manipulating and massaging, if you'll excuse the pun, the definition of inequality. Now let's do something else about inequality. Inequality within South Africa's black community, as anyone who studies the data knows, has increased. Why has it increased? Because there are now 6 million black people in the middle class. They have risen from the lower socioeconomic groups. When people's living standards rise, inequality increases. Now again, you can do this a priori, it's very simple. Imagine everyone on zero, and half the people go up to 1,000. That's an increase in inequality. You can decrease inequality by making everybody poorer. If you want to become a rich country, what you want is more and more people getting rich. The other issue was this sort of ILO love affair with basic needs, and this talk is if there is some kind of objective criterion for what these mean. In America, it means you only have 2 TV sets and you don't have the latest iPad and you swim in your neighbor's swimming pool instead of yours. In Chad or in Bangladesh or in the Bihar province of India, it means you scarcely are alive. You are living literally like an animal off garbage heaps. And they are all equal. Everyone on zero is equal. Everyone on zero has 100% unemployment. Now, there was a lot of, as I predicted, data. I would love to go through it all with you, but a time like this doesn't allow us. I've looked at this data. 500 economists say that there should be an increase in the minimum wage in the United States. There are 16,000 practicing academic economists in the United States, and there are regular surveys done on their opinion, and the majority, something like 70%, say that minimum wages increase unemployment. Then we hear about meta-analysis. Again, you can look at these meta-analysis and see which studies were in fact analyzed. And this glib statement, the data shows something. Well, the data shows that an increased minimum wage increases unemployment. I can also make that statement. I can also cite for you meta-analyses and studies. And I'm perfectly happy. If anyone here doesn't believe me, give me your email address. I'll send you the links or the sources. Anybody can find it. This is not, you don't have to be clever, you don't have to be an academic, you don't have to specialize in the field. You simply have to do research by looking. Straightforward, readily available data. Then we hear moderate increases have little effect. Of course. Increasing the minimum wage by 1 cent has very little effect. But the assumption that you can actually isolate cause and effect the way that Gilad suggested you can do is just not possible. There are far too many variables at work. Economics doesn't work like that. It's much, much more complicated. All you can do is say that if you make something more expensive, people are less likely to buy of it as much as they would have bought if it were cheaper. You can't argue with that. What you can argue with is the flexibility or the elasticity. In other words, if you make salt, the famous inelastic product, twice as much people will buy almost as much salt. Conversely, if you make going to the World Cup soccer final twice as much, it's highly elastic, many more people will watch it on TV instead. So there is elasticity. Now, your question of am I against a minimum wage? Yes, absolutely. A statutory minimum wage, we have one. I'm against it. It is zero. I think what we should do is allow all of the people who are 9 million human beings suffering, destitute, humiliated, marginalized, vulnerable human beings, especially young people who will be forgiven for becoming radicalized and criminalized. These are the people who should be allowed to earn something more than zero. Whatever it is they can get is better than zero. And I'm in favor of a very high minimum wage. I would like everybody to be a millionaire. How about that? I would like every unemployed South African, every employed South African to be a millionaire. But wanting that doesn't produce that. And the extent to which you decree it, and I want to say to a group of lawyers, lawyers work on the principle of positivism. In other words, they think if you want an outcome, you decree it. You make a law saying it shall be so. Economists, most economists, work on a position of analysis, is seeing what consequence things have, so-called unintended consequences. Now, a minimum wage's unintended consequence is not unemployment. A minimum wage's intended consequence is unemployment. You cannot rationally and intellectually deny that if you raise, and they actually admit it in their own work, that if you raise the minimum wage, you do increase unemployment slightly. Now, how much and where, no one knows. No one knows whether it is going to be as more in the taxi industry, less in agriculture, whatever it is. You don't know, but what you do know is people will buy less. So, I am against any legislated minimum wage. The reason is I'm in favor of human rights. I think you and you alone should decide whether you do a job for me and how much you get paid, and if the law says you may not take that job, I'm against that law. I think it is inhumane and unconscionable.
Refer to this for a second. you know, some of this, it's, I just want to be able to answer your own question. You know, Leon, some of this baffles me. Essentially, the implication to what you're saying is that there's no scientific way of studying economics, okay? Let's not do like regressions. Let's not try isolate what causes what with the most sophisticated and flawed techniques which economists have been using over the last like 50 years. Let's just use a common trope. Our gut logic that if you raise the price, you'll buy less, okay? So let's fire all the economists, which actually I'd probably be in favor of. Economists often don't have any idea what's going on. But, you know, let's fire them and let's replace them with a few common sense notions, right? That's the implication. I mean, that's essentially the implication of your disregard for the evidence. As you said, saying something over and over again doesn't make it true. There are no credible meta-analyses which show that that minimum wages, those studies congregate around a large employment impact. None. They don't exist. There's a study which is by Newmark and Washer, which is the closest to a meta-analysis which argues that, right? And that doesn't work. That's a descriptive review rather than an actual like meta-analysis, and it's been rejected by other academics in the field for its selection bias. So, you know, to come here and say, don't worry everybody, I can email them to you. I'm not going to show you like them because who cares about statistics? But believe me, I'm sorry, that just, for an issue of this importance, that just doesn't cut it. And moderate increases don't refer to 1 cent or 5 cents or whatever. Anyway, I'm getting excited. As soon as someone says it's a debate, you feel free to say things which perhaps one shouldn't say. Okay, on your question, in terms of skirting the issue, ultimately what the minimum wage is going to be set at is a political issue. And as someone who's sat in that NEDLAC room and listened to people argue, how that political solution is going to come about is anybody's guess. Okay? We think that there's various indicators which help guide that, and those indicators generally fall between 3,500 and 5,500 rand. Okay, and that's quite a wide range, and in particular fall between 4,000 and 5,000 rand range. Those are the commonly used indicators, which is basic needs, and I would agree wholeheartedly, Leon, that the understanding of basic needs is a very complex one, that poverty measures are insufficient, but we use what tools we have. So if you look at the poverty lines, if you look at the ratio of minimum wages to average wages, and if you look at our current levels in collective bargaining, all of those indicators which are used elsewhere in the world coalesce between 4,000 and 5,000 rand. Do I actually think that we're going to start with a minimum wage of 4,000 to 5,000 rand? I'd probably say no, off the record. Okay, that's my sense of what's going on. A lot of countries start low and they gradually increase. Maybe we'll start at 3,500 and we can gradually increase. Another important thing to bear in mind is that a lot of countries have a tiered system where you can actually take very low wage sectors like agriculture and domestic work, expanded public works, and you can peg them to a percentage. So they would start at say 70 or 80% of the minimum wage and gradually increase up to 100% in order to allow those sectors to adjust. Another thing which we've researched is the idea of a gradual increase through indexation. So you increase from, say, the 40% of the average wage to the 45% over a 5-year period. The point of the employment argument, right, and the point of the harmful effects argument is to say, okay, there might be harmful impacts. For example, there might be harmful impacts on small enterprises. Okay, a minimum wage can have positive benefits across a board. So how do we mitigate those harmful impacts? In Indonesia, they provided various allowances for small enterprises, right, because of their concern there. So the point as creative policymakers is to understand where there may be certain harmful impacts and take a otherwise positive policy and finesse it in a way that it has that positive impact. On compliance, I think this is a really, really important issue. I think that criminalizing non-compliance is actually important. I think we need to create awareness of what those minimum wages are. We need to look at a reallocation of inspectors. We have we have more inspectors per worker in the northwest and in other like rural provinces than we do in heavily industrialized provinces like in Gauteng. So we need to reallocate resources. We need to have recourse for workers so that they have means of complaining without fear of being fired. So there's a range of interventions. Unfortunately, our enforcement capacity in South Africa is very poor, and our rates of non-compliance are high. A national minimum wage can assist that simply through its simplicity. In Germany, huge billboards saying €8.50 every worker in that country knew. Go ask a domestic worker, what's your minimum wage in a rural area? He or she's not going to say it's 1,997 rand and 32 cents, which I think it is. No one knows that. So there's a range of things which we need to look at in terms of enforcement.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to throw it open, sir. First up.
My name is Lawrence, one of your colleagues from Pretoria.
Hello, Lawrence.
At the moment, let's assume that the national minimum wage is set around 3,000 something. Most bargaining council minimum wages are far above that at the moment. That's the end of the bargaining councils. Who's going to want to stay and be a member of a bargaining council when the minimum wage is lower? That seems to just doesn't make sense to me. If we look what's happening with the MEIBC now, which is the biggest bargaining council, we don't even have a minimum wage yet, and they can't even comply. Okay. Another problem is also this, what about all the atypical workers? You employ a casual to come and paint your roof, and how's he going to enforce his minimum wage? All the casual workers, outsourced workers, all the people on the periphery of employment. How are they going to enforce it? I share this problem with them, I must say, about enforcement. We can't just glibly say, yes, we'll criminalize it. We as commissioners at the CCNA have a tough enough time enforcing our own awards, and that is a highly regulated process, backed by the LRA and all sorts of things. I am absolutely at a loss as to how the national minimum wage will be enforced.
Thanks, Lawrence. Can I just appeal to all the speakers, if you don't know how that goodie gate works in front of you, just press the red button. Am I right? Yeah. Who's next? Ah, there we go. Lawrence is a quick learner. Are you done? Was that your last comment?
Well, just so everybody got that last point clear, because that really bothers me, and I think it would bother most people who are in our line of business, which is law.
Thanks, Lawrence. And can I just ask whoever's going to be next to just introduce themselves properly? The gentleman there, and I've met him this evening, Frank, is that right?
I'm also one of the colleagues, much more junior than you are. I think the comment I want to make is that the minimum wage issue is kind of vulnerable, not the entire population. Because if you go, for example, if you use the examples of the first speaker, if you go into the squatter camps and in the informal settlements, you'll find that, to your surprise, that many of these people have jobs. But they pay such starvation wages that they have no other place to live but in those shacks. The other thing is that, you know, the argument coming from people that want to control the populace because they have the privilege of controlling the means of production is always that they have a right. They don't have that right. They have that privilege. And the privilege is given to them not by law, but by the system that we have. And in this country here, we perhaps made a mistake of allowing employers to run amok with the economy in that fashion. If you take, for example, all things being equal, and you have a revenue of 100 rands, and part of that, a fraction of that has to be given to the workers who work the needs of your factories, and the other portion is the portion you take for yourself, then it means that you must decide how much that person is to get off that, and that person you give it to has no say in the matter. You don't need a lot of science in order to work this out. These things are very commonsensical. During apartheid times, for example, the discourse was that white people had the privilege to rule over black people. That was a debate in rooms like this. No one ever questioned the fact that the victims of that rule were in the streets, and they are the people that made the difference, not us here in rooms like this.
Thanks, Frank.
In my view, I think that despite the lack of science in the first speaker and the enormous amount of science in the second speaker, the common sense issue is simple, that you have to regulate in order to protect the most vulnerable people in society.
Thank you. Sir? So that's more of a comment made by Frank, I'm assuming. Lawrence has got some pertinent questions that he's posed, particularly to Gilad again. I want to give Leon some work to do here, folks.
Okay, my name is Paul. I'm from the CCM8 region.
I think the CCM is running scared with this enforcement issues.
I've got just one question for the gentleman from Leeds University. Is that I do not know whether it's coincidental or it just happened to be like that. This afternoon, as I was driving to this place, I listened to one of the radio stations, and actually on 702 there was a debate on this very same issue. I'm not too sure whether Leon was the one who was hosted or his colleague was there. Please, if you can confirm if we're hosted by somebody who
you can't be two places at the same time.
somebody who represented, I think, the organization actually argued that, as he has actually stated here, because he exactly captured what was said on the radio, that employees in South Africa should be given the freedom to choose. That the argument was further to the effect that certain categories of employees should even get a license, that the labor law should not apply to them, so that they can go and look for a job, and with that license, and then employers will be happy. They will enter into some arrangement with them, employment agreement, and then it will help to address the issues of minimum wage, you know. And I was affected by that. I did not agree with that approach. Firstly, because just in line with what Frank has said, South African's context is different, you know. South African employees, especially, I would say, historical employees in South Africa, from a historical perspective, they never had an opportunity to exercise that freedom. if you go back to even the writing of the Labor Relations Act, the reason why workers have the right to strike, it is constitutionally entrenched, and employees have recourse. The debate was centered on the equal basis that these parties do not engage each other from the position of economic equality or economic power. Now, the assumption that, based on what Leon has said, that are people in the rural setup, in the informal setting, when they meet Leon at his factory, they've got the freedom to choose. That is fallacious, I can tell you. I worked in the factories, I worked in the mine. In 1975, I worked in the factories. I never had a choice. I was just told I was a beginning and then go down to the mine. I never got that opportunity to exercise the freedom to choose. Even today, at every corner where you find these big buggies of capitalists, they just park and then everybody jumped into the buggy, and then from there you see them working, no negotiation about or exercise of that freedom. So on that basis, this does not actually fly. The freedom employers cannot exercise that. Now, with regard to the gentleman from VEF, I'm not too sure whether I saw anything in terms of his presentation relating to the benchmark within African continent, whether they did some research, because very late on Power FM, they interviewed a gentleman from Nigeria, where they have implemented this minimum wage, minimum wage and national minimum wage. They want, I think they are asking, they want to increase it from 18,000 naira to 56,000 naira. So I would have liked a situation where he, instead of going overseas and just come back home and do some real testing, benchmarking to test where they're at home in Africa. What is the situation?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I'm going to allow Leon to be first up with this. Yeah.
Yes, let me just say I agree with Lawrence. Frank, I just want to say that it's not a presence versus a lack of science, and I'm going to ask you to use your obviously very fertile imagination and imagine a slide up there with a whole lot of a list of studies and a list of papers and sources, and it looks very nice. I could also have done that, and I was tempted to actually. I actually was working on a presentation and decided not to. Then you would think it's science. No, it's not a presence and an absence of science. What there is a huge amount of science that suggests answers both ways. And in social science, as opposed to physical science, it is extremely difficult to move from a correlation or relationship to causality. It's actually impossible. So what you have to do when you find correlations is you have to say what might explain them. Now you can look at the macro analysis, which thousands of people have done, and there are thousands of papers in both directions. I think it's probably true, by the way, in the meta-analyses that essentially they produce no particular outcome either way. So they're sort of neutral. But there is a very simple way of testing the hypothesis, which is exceedingly scientific, is when you leave here this evening, you go to a local restaurant and you ask the restaurant owner or manager, what would they do if the price of the person who washes dishes goes up? And the answer is they buy a dishwashing machine. And what do you do if you're a farmer and you're having a farm activity that requires lots of labor, like cherry picking, and the price of cherry pickers goes up? Well, you dig out the cherry trees and you plant mealies which you can use in harvest time. So it is very scientific at the local level. You can ask people in this very university's canteen how they decide whether to employ more people or to employ more technology. And the answer is simple scientific arithmetic, which is the cheapest way of getting the outcome. And if you make employing people more expensive, then people do less of that, or they replace the labor with technology, or they replace low-skilled labor with high-skilled labor. And you know it, you do it in your own home. You might have moved from having, if they're very cheap, as they are in many countries, some of them in Africa, you mentioned the African studies, you use 2 domestic workers. And if the price goes up, you use a dishwashing machine and a vacuum cleaner. Everybody does it and everybody knows it. And to argue that it is not so does not change the difference between science and non-science, or science and nonsense. On the question, I didn't get your name, Pogum or something like that. I'm sorry if I missed it.
Talker.
Sorry? Talker. Okay, sorry, Talker. Yes, South Africa is not different. South Africa has the same laws of economics as any other country, and it's like in the airline industry, the law of gravity is the same regardless of your history. And if you say what we would do is like to lower the cost of planes taking off, well, we can do that. We can add more weight, we can put in less fuel, we can make the engine smaller. The consequence will be marginal, but 1 or 2 airlines will crash. And it doesn't help to say, yes, but what about our history, and what about our race, and what about my feelings, and what about the desire for decent flying, and whatever else. The fact is, the law of gravity is the law of gravity. And the law of economics is the same. It says if you charge more for something, people buy less. Or tanstafel. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Now, economists disagree about many things, although actually there's a high level of consensus amongst economists. But the one thing all economists agree about is there ain't no free lunch. Everything has a price, and the question is, what's the price? And whether you're in Africa, or whether you're in Europe, or whether you're ISIL, you have to observe the laws of physics when you fly a plane. And also you have to observe the laws of economics when you introduce minimum wages, which is you make it less likely that people who are vulnerable, the ones you care about, will get a job. If you do really care about those people, the one thing you do not want to do, Talker, is make it less likely that they will be employed, make it more risky, more costly, and more difficult to employ them. Those are the vulnerable people with whom I work. That's my job. That's what we in the Free Market Foundation do. We work in the townships to try and get people title deeds. 25 years after apartheid, black people still do not own the land on which they live. If you really cared about those vulnerable people, you would try to change that. You will meet me afterwards and say, how can you become involved? And I'll tell you. But the one thing you don't want to do for the people you say you care about is make it less likely that they will be employed. That is cruel, it is inhumane, it is uncaring, and it is unaffected by our history.
It's also untrue.
Gilad wants to pick a fight.
Let's continue with the airline analysis, okay? It's a nice one. The price of fuel goes up, right? Is the only thing that an airline can then do is make the cost of flying more and less people fly, okay? And the answer is no. You could try and get more fuel efficient airplanes. You could try and reduce, as we've seen, the amount of luggage which everyone takes on the airplanes. You could fly at different times of the day. Okay, I mean, I'm not a aeronautical engineer. Okay, but the analogy is very clear that there's not this extremely simplistic idea of price effects. It's not how economies work. Those 5 items which are listed in terms of how firms adjust, these come from the UK Low Pay Commission, the body which oversees the national minimum wage in the UK, and has been extremely successful. Firms alter to price increases in a range of different ways. The African continent, it's an important issue. I don't have there's 2 problems. The one is that there's very little data. There's been less studies done. The other problem is that the 2 or 3 key papers on that I read about 6 months ago and don't remember. There are countries which we can learn from, like in Cape Verde, for example, which has gone through a very similar process of instituting a national minimum wage last year, and did some quite innovative things on a policy level in terms of its design of that, and how it brought labour and business to agree on various things. So yes, I do think there's things to be learned from that, although the evidence is less. On the collective bargaining and bargaining the councils, I think this is an important point. My take on a national minimum wage, which I think is shared by many players in the process, is that it creates a wage floor, but does not replace either the ability to set higher sectoral minima through the similar processes that the ECC undertakes now, or collective bargaining. There still will be a need for collective bargaining. Labour unions, which is most labour unions, are not going to be impacted by a minimum wage. The mining sector will hardly be impacted except for outsourced workers in cleaning, etc. The metal work sector, very similar. Your large private sector industrial unions. The public sector, besides for expanded public works, which is its own thing, is also unlikely to be affected except for outsourced workers. So I still see a need for the marrying of a national minimum wage floor and the other instruments. In terms of the casual workers, there's two different issues here. The first is that we do need to protect casual workers. One way of doing that is that minimum wages as they work now both have an hourly have an hourly element, which is then multiplied into a monthly element. So times by 45 hours times by 4.33 weeks, and you get your monthly amount. So it's important that we're going to have simple round numbers, so that a casual worker can know they're entitled to it's 10 Rand or it's 15 Rand per hour. It's very difficult because ultimately the economy is about power relationships. It's very difficult for a casual worker to actually enforce that, but we need to ensure that that they have the available knowledge. The other issue is that there's ways of protecting part-time work. So for example, in domestic work, there's a higher hourly wage if the domestic worker works less than 27 hours per week. So you can put a premium on part-time work so that you don't see higher levels of casualization. I don't glibly want to say let's criminalize non-compliance, and the CCMA members in the audience have far more, as well as many labour lawyers, have far more practical experience than I do, certainly. But what I think the approach needs to be is that this is a potentially positive policy. Okay, we have a compliance problem. What's the basis of our compliance problem, and how do we fix that? And there's been good research done at the DPRU in Cape Town and elsewhere on what's hindering compliance, and it looks at resources, the complexity of the system, the monitoring of small firms, the incentives which enforcers get or they don't get, etc. And we also need to look at incentives for businesses to be voluntarily compliant, like in Brazil, where there is access to a subsidized credit if you're shown to be in compliance, and as well as an institutional remake of the ECC and the current way in which monitoring works. So that's a long conversation, and a really important one, but one which I think we need to say, okay, this policy could work. How do we ensure compliance so that it does work?
Thank you. Gilad, I just want to ask, we're going to conclude on that note. Is there any concluding remarks or just to round off your your input that you'd
Yeah,
like
if I
to
can
make?
just say, like, the last thing is that South Africa has low wages and it has had low wages, and we don't have full employment. And I think we need to, I don't think there's a convincing case that's been made for how, if we don't intervene with a minimum wage, if we leave wages like they are now, or if we lower wages, that suddenly the 9 million unemployed will be employed. The question is whether a national minimum wage can improve people's lives and whether it can do that without harmful effects. And I think the answer to that is yes.
Okay. I'm going to allow the young lady to have an opportunity to ask what she wanted to ask. Was it of Gilad though? Or doesn't it matter?
It doesn't matter, yeah.
Okay.
It's a simple question. My question is that obviously my understanding is that the national minimum wage is targeted to the most vulnerable workers. And that some sectors will be exempted, I believe. That's what was said. And I was just thinking about it, that if some sectors are exempted, it means that they will be put in the same situation that they were in before the minimum wage, meaning that they don't benefit from the national minimum wage. And I was thinking that, so if you are exempted, it means that you must be subsidized. So is there going to be a balance so that to make sure that they don't put in the same situation? That's my question.
Do you want to answer that quick, Gilad?
In 30 seconds, I don't think any sector should be excluded because it undermines the whole point. I think we need to think creatively around ways of including them which might deal with the economic realities. So the example I gave was that extremely low wage sectors could be included initially at a lower level, one which would be above what they earn now, but they would say earn 80% of the national minimum. And then the year after they could earn 85, 90, 95. It's a phase in order to let low wage sectors adjust. So we need to think about how we accommodate certain realities, but no sector should be excluded, or else it would undermine the idea of a national minimum. We talk about it more after.
Leon, an opportunity for concluding remarks?
Yes, I just do want to make this observation. Firstly, the idea that big industries, which is a kind of mythological idea that big industries can cope with. Yes, they do. The mining industry has coped. And what it has done is reduce the number of people per ton milled by fourfold. In other words, that it has cut labour spectacularly and replaced it with machinery. And in the new robotic age, this is a bigger risk than ever before. The ease with which people can be replaced is becoming greater and greater, and the cost of doing so greater and greater. And it is an extremely reckless thing to now start talking about a minimum wage. And the one thing that is important, and I want to leave you with this, every advocate of the minimum wage wants to do it a little. Why? Because they know that it causes unemployment, and all they want to do is do it so little that it doesn't cause so much unemployment that the cause gets noticed. So if you truly believe what you say, you have to explain why not increase it to R1 million a day. Well, why have a limit? And the answer is because you know, everybody knows, the consequences you throw people out of work. The famous British economist John Robinson said, the one thing worse than being exploited by capitalists is not being exploited, and she was on the left. And I'm going to close with a quote by two other economists on the left, Nicky Natras and Jeremy Seekins, his nemesis at the University of Cape Town, who accuse him of what they call unemployment denialism. That's what they call him. I wouldn't use such a name. I wouldn't repeat it, actually. And what they say is this. This is the science. Their view of the science. And they cite it. You can take this with you afterwards. They say every study in South Africa finds real wage increases reduce the demand for labour. The question is not whether wage increases destroy jobs, but how many jobs are destroyed, and how to weigh up the cost of job destruction with the benefits of higher wages. And let me remind you, The person who is unemployed is 100% unemployed. So the benefits of higher wages may well be some kind of macroeconomic nice thing, growth. But the people who are thrown out of work need you to stop and say, is this really what I want to inflict on my compatriots? Is this really what I want to inflict on our most vulnerable people? And if you do believe in the minimum wage, you have no objective reason for not raising it to R1 billion an hour. You know it causes unemployment. He knows it causes unemployment. As Nikki Matthews says, it's only a matter of quantum, not a matter of principle or science. And in fact, I say that's what all science says, contrary to it.
Thanks so much, Leon. Gilad. I'm going to call on Joanna to close the event for us.
They wanted me to put that other slide on with your conference details.
You sure you don't want to respond?
No, it's, I mean,
I'm teasing.
It's pointless.
Thank you everybody for attending this evening. We will be distributing Gilad's slides to everybody who attended the seminar, and Leon's slides or any research material Leon would like to distribute for those of you who inquired. To Gilad and Leon, thank you so much for the very fierce debate this evening. I hope we're not going to be criminalizing non-compliance, otherwise all us labor lawyers are going to have to dust off our varsity criminal law textbooks, and that's a bit scary. Thank you very much for being here, for coming through from Joburg, and on behalf of SASL, just a token of our appreciation.
It's a wine bag without the wine.
And then I'd also just like to thank Sean Christensen for stepping in on such late notice. Please stay and have a few glasses of wine and some food and drive home safely. And please don't forget the annual conference, the SASL annual conference is taking place on 22 and 23 July. There's going to be a lot of great speakers there. You don't want to miss it. Thank you.
Thanks.